Welcome to Critical Thinker. Our mission is to expand human consciousness by challenging and playing with ideas previously accepted as truth without much critical thought. And the idea worth discussing now is an idea often regarded with profound import, but quickly defined without much critical thought, and that is the idea of self. Now this relates to the age-old question often attributed back to Socrates, that is, to know thyself. But to even begin to think through this, we first have to define the idea of self. And like any good definition, it requires also defining what is not self. That is to say, the other. So in plain English, we are exploring what definition can we use to make I, the capital I, separate from you being you. At first thought, it seems like a very simple task. A first grader can tell you that I'm me and that any other person separate from me could be called other. And while the first grader cannot verbalize this as eloquently, they naturally would apply what I can only think to call the bag of skin as self-definition. That is, everything inside one continuous bag of skin should be labeled as an individual self, and all other bags of skin are separate and therefore can be called others. And it's easy to see from natural selection perspective why this type of thinking would be very useful in a hostile environment of gene survival. But if you keep thinking through this superficial definition for just a moment longer, you realize it is disprovable. In fact, 4.5 million Americans need blood transfusions every year, an operation in which blood from one bag of skin is removed, stored, and eventually injected into another bag of skin. The same can be said about organ transplants. The fact that objects from outside environment can be put into our bag of skin complicates this oversimplistic definition of self. It adds the complexity of a fluid or changing self, one open to manipulation and change. Perhaps a more common example is something we do every day. To breathe and to eat is to exchange tiny particles from the outside world into the within world. The carbon atoms that make up most of organic matter have taken many forms in the universe, including the structure of other plants and animals, and even long ago dead humans decomposed into the soil to be later absorbed through a potato perhaps. Which, by the way, now you can see why the ancient Hindu teachings of reincarnation could come from. So if we decide that we don't want to operate with this overly simple and constantly changing definition of ourselves as a bag of skin, because it's just far too easily influenced and changed, then we will eventually arrive at one of the best definitions of self, or we should say the highest definition of self, and that is the self as the observer. You are not your body, thoughts, actions. Even your skin cells will die and be replaced by entirely new cells. But the one thing that's constant is your unique human consciousness of observing the outside world with your bodily senses, of course, eventually being interpreted by the brain. But even this philosopher's dream of a definition of self can't explain why self only includes your consciousness as separate from other or more universal consciousness. So, picture, if you will, a giant ant colony with one of those great mounds built all up that you can see on nature shows. This colony, with millions of individual ants with their own bags of skin, or I think you would call them exoskeletons, operates like a single conscious being. Each ant is programmed to fill a certain task, just as human cells are programmed to fill different functions of the body. And through chemical and electrical communication, the ants are able to operate the colony as if it were a single conscious being. It would be just as silly for an ant to think of himself as an independent, creative creature as it would for one of your red blood cells to pass another red blood cell and think of itself as being separate or an independent being. Or it's as foolish as if your thumb had a level of self-awareness that it thought itself different from the other fingers on your hand. It would look around and say, my thumbnail is better than those other long, skinny fingers. I don't care about them. I just need to look out for myself, the thumb, and that's all. I could care less what happens to those other skinny fingers. Well, we know this is just silly, because we have the perspective to zoom out and see the thumb as just a part of and connected with all the other fingers by something we choose to name as a hand. But with the same meta perspective in mind, we can zoom a telescope deep out into space, and we look back at the Earth as one giant organism filled with interrelated, cohabitating cells, all working together, many times eating each other, dividing amongst each other, but all under an illusion of separateness. But to the faraway observer, it's all just one thing. Now that humbles you. It connects us all. This definition of self as everything, not separate from, but better understood as a part of everything, is useful. It is why all the great religious texts eventually arrive at what in Christianity is referred to as the Golden Rule. And what is the Golden Rule? To love thy neighbor as thyself, to treat others as you would want to be treated. But really, this is a mistranslation. To treat others like thyself is to treat others as thyself. It all justifies our little thought experiment. When you love your neighbor, it is a form of self-love. You are increasing the benefits to the entire organism which you are merely a part of. So to know thyself, or in more modern parlance, to just be yourself, is to act in accordance with nature as an integrated and dependent part of a greater environment. It is a human illusion that we are independent of each other and our environment. We are like wildflowers, allowing the universe to express itself, but all still connected to the same underlying root system. Now, this knowledge is not intuitively easy to grasp, but with a little effort and focus, it reveals itself to be the most logical conclusion that coincidentally happens to match some of our highest spiritual teachings.